Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Watier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Watier, and I'm here as always with my good friend and colleague Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey Scott, how are you?
Doing fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We are going to be getting into sodium, minerals, and the truth about low-carb diets combined with fasting and what the science really says. So we are just going to be myth-busting 101 today, giving you the most updated recent data and research on salt and low-carb diets and their effectiveness. So before we get into it today, Tommy, I want to welcome in all the new listeners. If you are new to the Fasting for Life podcast and the Fasting for Life world, thanks for giving us a shot. Hopefully we become part of your weight loss, wellness, and health journey. If you want to know more about Tommy or myself, head back to episode 1, give it a listen. It is our most downloaded episode because it gives you insights into why we do what we do, why we come week in and week out delivering a podcast episode with actionable steps, why we have our challenges, why we have our coaching, why we have all the free resources on the website. Head to the show notes if you're looking for some additional support. We have it for you. So welcome in. Thanks for giving us a shot. And for the long-term listeners, shout out to you as always for continuing to be on this journey with us. We are not at the destination yet. We are playing the long game of using fasting to achieve our weight loss, health, and long-term goals. So thank you for being dedicated listeners. Thank you for the downloads, the shares, the likes, the subscribes, the rate, reviews, what other platform you're on these days. I can't keep track of them all, but we are grateful for you, Tommy. So as we get into today's conversation, I want to set the stage with a couple of the key things that we run into initially when you're starting fasting or trying to get fasting to be more consistent in your day-to-day life. Now, we can talk about diabetes and diabetes reversal and prevention. We can talk about the benefits of weight loss. You know, we have hundreds of episodes on all and everything in between. But when we're looking at a couple of the things that we hear initially, or when you're really working on getting that consistent moving of the needle with adopting a lifestyle and getting off of that diet mentality or that diet roller coaster, we need to talk a lot about hydration and water, right? Because that's some old diet baggage. I got to get my gallon of water in a day.
Sure.
And then what about low carb? What does the research say? Where does it stand? We've changed our tune on low carb. Now, we're not going to talk specifically about trying to reverse diabetes, which, we're going to recommend a 90-day run of keto. We got a whole dedicated podcast episode on why we believe that, what the research says. Doing keto for 90 days, absolutely beneficial. But we want to talk for blood sugar reversal, diabetes management, etc. But we want to talk big picture about what we see in the shifts when it comes to standard medical care. When it comes to low-carb diets or low-carb interventions or keto interventions, and then salt, and how we want to talk about proper hydration, because we have an entire portion of our day 1 of our 7-day Master Your Fasting challenges. We talk for about 15 minutes just on this concept of proper hydration. So that's where we're going to be taking you today. We're going to answer some of the key questions or key sticking points when it comes to making these lifestyle changes, when it comes to your food or your hydration. And we're going to share with you the most recent research on both of those topics, Tommy. So I'm excited for the conversation today.
Yeah, me too, because a lot of what we hear about salt and, growing up 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, there was a lot about low fat and low sodium. Those were kind of some of the big dietary directives, especially for getting healthier.
1980 U.S. dietary guidelines were first published, and this is where the anti-salt movement came from and the anti-fat movement came from. So keep going.
Yeah, so depending on when you were born, you may have been born into that like I was, or may have watched it kind of yeah, that's true. But you may have watched it unfold, or you may have just grown up into a system where that kind of already had taken strongholds. And so that's problematic for the way that we think about these things, because essentially there was a lot of misunderstanding. There were a lot of conflicts of interest that were involved in a lot of those regulations, in those recommendations. And so we're still kind of fighting a lot of that old mentality that goes along with some of our old diet baggage and why things weren't working in the past, and misunderstandings. Even when you're living a healthy lifestyle or you're making deliberate healthy food choices, a lot of the time it can still feel like you don't quite understand why you learned something a long time ago, but why everything else is kind of why the science or the conversation is kind of moving in a different direction. Salt is one of those big things where we bring a lot of things where even a lot of the doctors still have a big misunderstanding about sodium and sodium recommendations and what should be done. So when we're talking about a ketogenic lifestyle, or getting into ketosis, and you using low carb strategically, and
Plus
then
fasting.
plus fasting, when we put intermittent fasting or extended fasting on top of that, the conversation becomes even more important about deliberate use of good quality salts. And that's very different from like the old recommendations from the processed food, industrial food model that is talking about a completely different source of sodium chloride table salt versus what we're talking about with salt supplementation. So I just want to start with the foundation of that.
Yeah. And the other side of that is when you start intermittent fasting, and we hear this a lot, and or you start extending your fast, and or you go low carb, right? Because carbohydrates have been demonized. And we have some very clear recommendations on what we believe your macronutrient breakdown should be in terms of optimization for long-term body composition and long-term sustainability when it comes to weight loss and health. We typically, if you want those exact metrics and numbers and percentages, you can head to the show notes, click the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss. It's a free 20-page PDF. It has all the stuff in there that you could possibly need, as well as some fasting schedules. But salt's been demonized, right? There's this carbohydrate confusion, right, that's out there. And one of the things when you go fast, you start fasting or extend your fast and or go low carb, you really have to look at the hydration component because of what you just said. Because what happens is insulin comes down, insulin sensitivity goes up, which is good. We want insulin low. We want blood sugar lower. But then that tells the kidneys and aldosterone to say, all right, well, we don't need to retain this anymore. So that's where you lose the minerals and proper electrolyte balance that you need to make fasting and the low carb adaptation easier. That's why I said when we were talking about fasting consistency, that hydration, that's why we talk about it on day one of our challenge as well, because it is a key component of breaking through those barriers and those kind of missteps or struggle points when you start adopting or continuing to extend a fasting lifestyle. So when we're looking at big picture, we want to just talk about the myths and facts about low carb and the myths and facts about salt. And to be honest, there's been a shift from the diabetes associations, not just here in the US, but across the world, that they're now recognizing that lower carb diets for diabetes or ketogenic diets are actually beneficial. Where you go to your doctor, the doctor's going to say, most likely, now there's a lot more awareness to this now, which is why I think this is a cool conversation, but they're going to say, okay, reduce your sodium intake less than 3 grams a day, ideally less than 2.3 grams per day. Because salt gets blamed for what insulin in an obesogenic food environment or a highly refined processed food environment causes. So salt gets blamed for what insulin causes. And then you ask, well, the doc says, well, you need to lose some weight. Your labs are a little bit off. And you go, okay, well, how do I do that? And they say, well, eat a plant-based diet, eat a macronutrient-based diet. But it's not widely known that they don't have a lot of nutritional, most medical programs, and we have doctors inside of our coaching programs, don't have any nutritional training.
Right.
That's just not part of their lexicon and how they take care of patients. So they don't have that tool in their tool belt. So when we look at the big picture of why we want to have this conversation, and I love this study that came out of the Journal of Nutrients. This is the first study about the myths and facts, and this was in 2025. So this is new research by Nina Teichholz and her team, And I love Nina. She's the unsettled science person. She's a rock star.
Hmm.
And the whole idea here is that we need to look at this chronic disease rise that we're having in the US, and we can extrapolate that across the world to other countries as well.
Right.
But 93% of Americans having risk factors using medications for conditions like diabetes, obesity, and heart disease. Yet we have more deaths from heart disease every single year and more people on cholesterol medications every single year. Yet we're getting worse and worse and worse. The problem's just getting worse. We're spending more money, trillions of dollars a year on these chronic lifestyle conditions. So the idea here is we want to set the stage for the understanding and urgency of improved and innovative strategies to kind of help give you the tools combined with fasting and or low carb and or proper hydration, right? That you can be able to create sustainability or consistency. So for instance, there's been a shift from major health organizations when it comes to low carb. For the ADA, the American Diabetes Association, and Diabetes Canada now accept low-carb eating patterns as a viable management system for type 2 diabetes, where the old was balanced diet, food pyramid, lower calorie method. But if the number one macronutrient that drives blood sugar and insulin resistance, which then throws off your kidney signaling, which then drives salt as the culprit to raise blood pressure, which is a risk for cardiovascular disease, that model is outdated.
Yeah.
So it highlights that previous epidemiological studies linked low-carb diets with increased mortality, but those aren't actually accurate because those diets were shown to have excess calories from carbohydrates rather than being more strict, which is what we say and what the research shows is that if you're doing more keto, anywhere in that 10 to 15% range, all the way up to that 25% range of your daily caloric intake coming from carbohydrates. So we don't need to demonize carbohydrates, the natural, non-refined, non-processed forms. They're good for hormone production in women, for progesterone production. So there's a place for it. But it also challenges the notion that low-carb diets lead to negative health effects, like kidney function or increased heart disease risk. And the reality is that the efficacy of those low-carb diets has really been shown to be the complete opposite.
Yeah. Where to start? So
I know I just said a lot of words.
well, whole food diets, fruits and vegetables combined with or without natural like meat sources, real meat. Those carbohydrates, they have things that the body needs. And the tricky part is that a lot of these old epidemiological like misunderstandings and oversimplistic interpretations of them that then led to things like lower sodium recommendations was based on the delta, the difference between the health outcomes of people who were essentially utilizing more of a whole foods based diet versus a more processed food diet.
Can we
And
just say
so,
faulty science?
sure, yeah, we absolutely can. And but I think it's helpful to understand that if you were eating a primarily whole foods based diet versus a highly processed standard American diet, your intake of sodium would be is somewhere in the 5 to 10 times difference range. It's a vastly different sodium intake. And so then you can correlate that you can correlate those health outcomes that are going to come from those two groups, and you could mistakenly say that it's based on the sodium intake. It's based on so much more than that, and the physiological problems that come from the an overly processed diet. But if you look at it and then you say, okay, well, salt intake was higher on the processed side, so let's just limit salt, and that's going to eliminate some of those problems or lessen them. That's a completely wrong interpretation of that. But that's one of the ways that interpretation can kind of come about. And so just understanding that in the processed food environment, where the sodium chloride comes from, and the fact that we're talking about literal sodium chloride versus full spectrum, full trace mineral and mineralized natural salts and salt sources, that's very, very different first of all, and then what happens inside the body to actually clear out that table salt, the sodium chloride, is really, really against good health outcomes. And we'll kind of get into a little bit more about why. I think that's also kind of an important understanding about where some of these recommendations came from.
All right. So when we're trying to paint the palette, the big picture here, the
Mhm.
landscape, recent research definitely shows the benefit for diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular risk when it comes to low carb and ketogenic diets.
Mhm.
The problem is you do those plus fasting, that's going to accelerate the sodium and water loss via aldosterone in the kidney signaling. So that's going to risk mineral depletion, increase stress hormone production, if not compensated with adequate sodium intake.
Mhm. Yep. Good point.
So salt's been demonized, decrease your salt. Well, the research is pretty clear when it comes to salt, and we've touched on a couple of these things. And the article that we're referencing is the sodium intake, life expectancy, and all-cause mortality. So this is a study done in 2021. And it found that dietary sodium intake is positively associated with life expectancy and inversely related to all-cause mortality. So as
More
sodium,
salt is better.
salt is better.
Yeah.
As you increase salt, and we'll talk about good sources of salt here in just a minute. We'll give you a whole list of them. They live longer and experience fewer overall deaths. The researchers in the study challenged the common belief that a high salt diet is inherently harmful and responsible for shortening the lifespan. So this was done across 181 countries for moderate sodium consumption. So we're talking 4 grams a day. We're going to reference another Journal of Medical Association article here from 2014 that shows that 4 to 6 range as well has shown a decrease in cardiovascular risk. So let's just put it this way. You call the ambulance, you're having some form of cardiovascular event. What's the first thing they put you on?
Salt drip.
A bag of fluids, which has 9 grams of salt in it, right?
Mhm. Yep.
So when we're looking at these different groups, there's a non-linear relationship between sodium and health outcomes. So the life expectancy increased with higher sodium consumption, about that 4 to 5 gram per day mark. And it did not find a clear link between intake and more all-cause mortality, heart disease, and stroke. So the research is really clear that we are undersalting, and we also have the wrong target.
Mm.
We need to be focusing on not the salt, but the form of salt and the proper hydration to reduce that all-cause mortality risk. So when we look at how we do that, and you start to go fasting and low carb, you're going to excrete those minerals that you need, those trace minerals that you need.
Mhm.
Those are related to a whole host of other things. But from a pain point standpoint, when you start fasting and go low carb, you're going to be peeing a lot. You're going to be trying to get in more water. But what we'll see is that you'll hit that keto flu or the headaches, the dizziness, the fatigue, the upset stomach. You might feel a little woozy. That's not a bad thing. That just means that you flushed out all of those ancillary minerals that come in with a good source of salt, not just table salt or sodium chloride.
Right. And so we need to be bringing those in deliberately, because if you also understand what's going on when you put ketogenic diet along with intermittent fasting and you start burning through some of those excess fat stores that you have, you get to tap into those for energy, right? For literal caloric fuel to fuel your body.
Ketone production.
Right. And as you're doing that, those fat cells, unfortunately, they're not able to hold on to very many minerals or salts along with the caloric energy. So you can tap into the energy for fuel, but then at the same time, your electrolytes need to be coming in on a fairly consistent basis, day in, day out, throughout the day, and each day, regardless of if you're on a super long fast or extended fast or a shorter fast. Now, the more nutrition opportunities you have in a day, the more times you're actually sitting down to eat, the more salts and trace minerals you're going to be bringing in naturally from your foods, whether they're more whole food based, or if they're processed, either way, you're going to be bringing in more salts. So the longer the fast, the more salt supplementation is going to be needed for sure, but it's going to need to be deliberate and planned for. And it's also a good thing to think about this as a long-term part of a healthy fasting lifestyle, even to maintain your weight, not necessarily just for fat loss purposes. And I think that there's that's good to understand as developing this as a long-term tool rather than just a fasting diet, right?
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the other stress hormones and metabolites with proper sodium intake and the benefits of that. But if you're out there listening, you're going, well, what about increased salt, increased blood pressure? Right? Like what about that component? Because that's typically the main like pushback that we hear.
Sure.
Right? Well, it's actually the opposite. So what happens is when you are having lower sodium intake, that is going to tell your body and aldosterone to tell the kidneys to conserve it. So you're going to keep it. You're going to hold on to it, which is ultimately going to raise your blood pressure. If we can increase your salt, it's going to then tell your body and your, hey, we don't need to keep this anymore. So you can let it go and we'll see that blood pressure drop. So the research is really clear on this, because if the FDA was saying lowering salt intake will accomplish the goal, which is decreased vascular, cardiovascular risk, better health outcomes, less mortality, we would see it. But the Inner Salt study looked at 10,000 people across 48 global populations. No correlation between salt intake and hypertension. The Framingham Offspring study found that sodium intake under 2.5 grams were linked to higher blood pressure, and sodium intakes above that 2.5 gram or the FDA recommended RDA allowance. That was in 2,600 people without hypertension. In other words, low sodium group had higher blood pressure. And then the Cochrane collaboration in 2020 did a systematic review and found that sodium restriction was linked to less than 0.5 point reduction on average in blood pressure in normal intensive Caucasian folks. With weak evidence, there might be a slight, a better outcome in the African American and Asian populations. So the negative side effects of sodium restriction were more consistent than the effect on blood pressure.
Right.
We've got the wrong target.
Sure. 100%. You can take it a step further. Think about those first few pounds that you might drop, that you might see a scale whoosh when you go from, I've been putting on a few pounds, kind of doing the same thing, and all of a sudden I want to turn things around. I want to start my new diet or start my new fasting protocol, my new fasting regime. And then you see those first few pounds kind of come off the scale. And intuitively, like we hear talks about water weight. Well, some of that's just water weight, right? And we kind of slough that off as, well, it's not fat. So
it's a whoosh.
It doesn't really count, right? Or something like that. We can kind of minimize the importance of that water weight. But here's the deal. That water weight's really, really important. And it's also a sign that we've been storing carbohydrates in the liver and in the skeletal muscles as glycogen. It's really, really important, but it's going to need to clear out first before we start tapping into long-term fat stores. Okay. So that's the important point number one. Important point number two is that if our body is undersalted, just from a chemistry standpoint, it's not going to want to let go of that water weight, which then leads to tapping into those long-term fat stores. If we're undersalted, then our body's going to be fighting against the process of letting go of the water weight so we can get to the fat stores. So that's problematic, and it leads to slow results even when you're doing everything else the right way. So undersalting means your fasting efforts aren't nearly as productive as they should be.
So real life application. So sodium retention, low sodium retention mode. That causes aldosterone, renin, angiotensin, and norepinephrine. So we're going to talk about hormones in just a minute and stress hormones. So that's going to retain. So those hormones actually raise blood pressure. So it's not the salt, it's the hormones. It's the undersalted state. Never mind the fact that osteoporosis can be another consequence of a low salt diet. And the low sodium or low salt symptoms, here they are: low energy, headaches, muscle cramps, fatigue, weakness, insomnia, and malaise.
Mm.
We already mentioned the keto flu, or when you combine fasting and low carb, right?
Yeah.
So
It's the under salt flu.
wait a minute. So every time my mom comes and visits, she flies on an airplane. They don't drink a lot of water. They're in their 70s. So when they get here, what do? They do an element, an LMNT
Mm-hmm.
in water. Because if my mom doesn't do that, guess what she has that night when she sleeps? Leg cramps.
Like crabs. Yeah.
So you have a tool in your tool belt. Never mind if you've got insomnia, malaise, weakness, fatigue, you're not going to want to do the thing you're supposed to do, like set your fasting timer, work out, get moving.
Right.
Never mind a poor night of sleep. If you want an optimizer for sleep, take a half a teaspoon of salt before bed. Oh my goodness.
Game changer.
Game changer.
Because you're getting in front of that dehydration effect that's going to happen over the next 8 hours.
We also know a poor night of sleep or disrupted sleep, blood sugar, if you're waking up in the middle of the night multiple times, it's a blood sugar regulation issue. But a poor night of sleep will make those fasting and food choices that next day so much harder.
Right.
Because of the metabolic changes that take place, because of your cravings and your hunger hormones that go up.
We need
So
to be
salt
doing,
is much more important. Go ahead, Tommy.
we need to be doing more things that make the next fast easier, right?
Yes, 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 and more yes. So let's talk about a little bit about the other combinations of what salt does in terms of those hormones that we mentioned.
Okay.
So there was a study in the European Heart Journal in 2020 that analyzed sodium intake, life expectancy, and all-cause mortality. So that's the study we mentioned. And then higher sodium intake correlated positively with a healthy life expectancy and an inverse in all-cause mortality. So we mentioned that earlier, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about the intake and the stress hormone, or those hormones that we mentioned. So higher sodium intake increases that cortisol excretion. So what is cortisol? Cortisol is your stress hormone, right? So your stress response hormone. A couple other drivers of insulin resistance are stress and poor sleep, because they mimic the effect of insulin or can contribute to insulin resistance. So if you are increasing your salt, you're going to be decreasing your cortisol. Now, cortisol is good, but if you have elevated cortisol or you live a very stressful life, guess what? That's helpful. It's also going to help activate your HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is the thing that regulates that stress response. So for me, the trifecta of developing insulin resistance over the years was stress, sleep, and my food choices through college and the restaurant years. So when you are increasing your salt intake, that is going to help balance and help reset your body's ability to have that normal stress response. When you're low salted, you're going to increase cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine and all those hormones, which is going to, again, conserve the sodium, which makes the blood pressure go up.
Yeah.
So increasing the salt intake is going to help with your stress response, your cortisol excretion, and pretty much just balance a lot of those signaling hormones that drive that blood pressure, or that mythical, relationship between the two.
You know what's also good for balancing is, like I mentioned, whole foods versus processed foods earlier.
Yes.
More whole foods versus and less processed foods is going to give you a better salt balance, because your average quality of your salt is going to go up. Because when you have stripped down table salt, the body's counter reaction to that is it's going to have to excrete that excess sodium chloride that's coming in, because you're going to have too much sodium chloride, not enough potassium, not enough magnesium, not enough of any of the other trace minerals, let alone the electrolytes. So because your body's going to be fighting excess sodium chloride, because it would lead to real big problems in the brain, the spinal cord, all of your nervous system tissue, your musculoskeletal system. Those are dictated by sodium potassium pumps all over the body. And so if you have the wrong ratio of sodium and potassium, it will cause misfiring all throughout the body. So your physiology is set to prevent that problem. So more processed foods equals more stripped down sodium chloride coming in, not being balanced by potassium and magnesium also. So you need these things in the right ratios. So
100%, especially for heart health.
For sure. And
Yeah.
so your food choices matter. And then it's especially important to take into account when you are fasting consistently and you have less frequent nutritional opportunities, then it's going to be up to you to deliberately supplement properly with these things.
100%. So intentional salt and proper hydration. So not drinking more water, but proper hydration. So, and this leads to the conversation about the difference between sodium and what a healthy salt looks like, right?
Mm.
So for instance, like a table salt, it's mostly industrial, often from seawater or rock salt. It's highly refined, bleached, anti-caking agents, sometimes iodized. Very high sodium content by weight. All the other minerals are stripped out. It has those pick up a little salt packet at your deli, your local deli or sandwich shop. It's going to have
Hmm.
dextrose in it, synthetic iodine, anti-caking agents. So, yeah, we should be limiting that stuff. Of course.
Sure.
It's
Yeah.
not great. The difference is when we look at Redmond real salt, Baja Gold, or other unrefined salts, this is where we're going to see those minerals that you were just talking about, that proper balance, magnesium, potassium. That's why we love Element,
Hmm.
because it has the main minerals. It gives you that sodium, potassium, and magnesium that you need to help balance everything out, right?
Hmm.
So, and we're looking at it, that sodium, potassium, magnesium balance is really what we want to look for that proper hydration. So, the difference between healthy salts and the Morton's table salt is that they're mined, like Redmond's is mined from ancient seabeds. It's got 60 trace minerals, no additives, none of that stuff in it. It's got higher calcium. Baja Gold, evaporated from the pristine estuary in Baja, California, 90 trace minerals. It does have lower sodium in Baja, so if you are salt sensitive, it might be better to go start with Baja Gold
Hmm.
versus maybe a Redmond's or a Celtic Sea Salt. So there's
Hmm.
Vera salts, Icelandic sea salts, Redmond salt. For us in the U.S., Redmond's just a go-to. Baja Gold is great, like I said, if you need some more trace minerals, if you're having some hair loss or you need some additional thyroid support, that would be great to use Baja Gold because it has
Yeah.
90 compared to the 60. We've got gray Celtic sea salt. All of these have been third-party tested for very low lead, arsenic, cadmium, mercury, microplastics, right? So
Nice. Love that.
all of them are in play, but you got to try it. Just like when somebody says, "Oh, I tried magnesium for leg cramps." Okay, well, what form did you use? When did you take it? How much did you take? Magnesium is used in 700 physiological processes in the body. You tried one form for one thing. Like we need to try the right form for the right application. So using a real salt is going to drastically improve your hydration and how you feel when you're looking for consistency with going low carb and or keto and or fasting.
Yeah, these things will help deliberately make that next fast that much more productive, but easier, less like you're having to white knuckle it, right? Which is exactly what we want to see because the more we can make things comfortable, predictable, and less frustrating, the
Yeah.
lower we can keep fasting frustration, the more likely we are to stay on track, consistently be hitting our targets, and then also start maintaining our results through long-term lifestyle adaptations rather than just feeling like, oh man, I got through that last fast, but I hated every minute of it. So I don't want to be doing this long term, right? Which that tends to go to lean into diet mentality. So I think the salt conversation is a really important one. Understanding that a keto lifestyle or low carb cycles with low carb, or even if that's your lifestyle because you enjoy it, it works best for you. I think that's great to know and to understand, but it's still going to require and probably even more so require deliberate salting and salt supplementation over time. That just has to be part of the regimen.
Yeah, and before we get a message on, I want to mention Himalayan salt too. If
Yeah.
you have a pure source of Himalayan salt, great, but there has been some recent concern over the Himalayan salt having microplastics in it.
Hmm.
So not saying if you're using it and it's working great, but just another piece of consideration because we hadn't mentioned that because that's typically another form that people will ask us about.
Right.
So for me, I use Element. I do an Element every morning plus a half a teaspoon of Redmond real salt in my water in
Hmm.
40 ounces. I prime my hydration for the day. before my coffee most days. Some days, not all days, but most days I'll get that in. Probably 5 or 6 days out of the week, I'll get that in
Nice.
before, to set myself up for optimal function. So, I mean, we talked about in the beginning of the conversation, the updated research on the efficacy of low carb diets. Yes, if you're following this podcast, you know that we truly believe, and done hundreds of research articles and conversations on this podcast about the efficacy of fasting and how it can benefit long-term weight loss and health and blood labs and reversal of diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. I want to make sure we didn't miss the part about how proper hydration and its effects on your metabolism and the stimulation of those cortisol and stress hormones. So a balanced sodium, kind of like a U curve, right? Which is supported by the Journal of Medical Association and the research articles that we showed before, that there is no correlation or direct relationship to increased blood pressure and or cardiovascular risk and or all-cause mortality, right? So the idea here is that you're going to start fasting keto and or low carb. You're going to have some of these sticking points. We want to think long-term in what is the cost-benefit ratio of adding this into our routine or our lifestyle. Well, it's clear that there's multiple different things in terms of benefit, and you need to figure it out. So if you are salt sensitive or you are on a blood pressure medication, this is not medical advice, but this is the pushback that we get from friends and family and people that aren't in our sphere. It's like, oh, well, yeah, I got to keep my sodium low. Well, you're actually stressing the stress hormones in your HPA axis and slowing down your metabolism. We need to find the balance for you. So if you're not salting and you're doing 2 grams, right? FDA 2.3 grams, FDA recommendation. Don't just go, start with a teaspoon of Redmonds and a half an element, right? Like wean yourself up onto it. Start with a quarter of a teaspoon. Go up to a half a teaspoon. Go up to, slowly see how your body changes and how you feel when you're doing your fasting and sticking to your low carb or your keto food choices.
Yeah, because remember, as insulin comes down, then we get to excrete more of that water. So it's going to help balance these systems and our hormone levels and also our salt levels too. So as we get low carb eating or a keto lifestyle, as we get more of those things right more of the time, and as we get more consistent with our fasting, then it tends to bring insulin down over time, which then has a beneficial effect on blood pressure with or without salt supplementation. So that's a great thing. So it kind of changes the equation for you from how you think about it from before, especially coming from an eat less, move more, and especially if you're on like blood pressure lowering medication. So one other thing that I wanted to mention is just the fact that growing up, salt supplementation, I would hear about it, but it seemed like it was mostly coming from elite athletes and people who were like outside, like doing really vigorous training for hours in a day. And there would be people at the CrossFit gym and other places who would be supplementing with salt, but it felt like mere mortals didn't really do that. And there was kind of a divide right there. And so when you get into consistent fasting or low carb lifestyle or both, then it's like you're in a situation where your salt needs do go up. And so it can feel like, yeah, I'm doing the things that those athletes do, maybe to a lesser extent, but still it can be a little bit of like cognitive dissonance where you don't necessarily feel like, do I really need this? But the answer is absolutely yes. And it's for the same reasons that those athletes needed it, because they're going through their salt supplies so quickly, and they're turning it over throughout the day. They need to be supplementing with those.
I have one more little optimizer or hack that I don't want to forget, is that if you are salt averse and you don't like the taste or the flavor, Element's great. Yes, it's there. They also have a homemade version of how to make your own at home.
Yeah.
But an easy way to increase your sodium intake is broth. Not the low sodium broth, which is marketed all over the shelves, but like bone broth or broth will hide that sodium. So, but I'm fasting. Okay, great. But would you rather have fatigue, headaches, dizziness, hunger, muscle aches, etc., all of the presentation of some of the things when you start your fasting lifestyle, or adopting a new low carb keto application to your nutritional choices?
Right.
No. I mean, this is an easy way. So yeah, have a cup of broth. have a couple of cups of broth a day. This is only going to help stay with where we started this conversation, is getting the consistent repetitions to keep the movement needing, to keep the excitement up, to adopt that lifestyle.
Wow, what a great point. I just pulled up a nutrition label for Bonafide, and so they don't add salt into it. So these are the naturally occurring salts from the bones. So same mineral proportions as you would find, in any natural, in a natural occurring meat source. So that's a great way to get a natural source of salt. So I love that you mentioned that.
Yeah, it's just an easy, like, well, if you can't handle, I just shoot it. I don't care.
Sure.
Just, it's a mouthful of salt water. It's gone in a couple of seconds. It's fine. Now in the morning, I do use half an element, to give it a little bit of flavor and hide that. So just got to try it out, figure out what works for you. But the research is absolutely clear on the application from the Diabetes Associations and all the research we shared, that low carb is effective. If you want to reduce, if you have blood sugar issues or diabetes or pre-diabetes, or you're worried about that, then yeah, absolutely adopting a low carb plus fasting lifestyle or a keto plus fasting lifestyle, 100%. We have an entire episode dedicated to 90-day keto, therapeutic keto, like do keto for 90 days. This is what you can expect to see in terms of your labs and blood sugar numbers. And it's incredible. So you just got to kind of play around with it, but looking for that consistent fasting effort. Understand that salt is your friend, that low carb can be your friend. We don't want to restrict and omit your way. You're never going to look at another piece of bread again. We want to have natural forms of carbohydrates. So we recommend about that 20% mark. If you want to go more keto, it's less than that. And the research that we shared today went all the way up to about 25% to fit that category. Now, when you do that and you remove carbohydrates, please prioritize protein in its place.
Right.
That is, prioritize protein. So if you're looking for more support, head to the show notes, click the link. We got the blueprint to fasting for fat loss. We got the upcoming challenge. If you want to accelerate your results and hear us talk about this key component of hydration on day one, at the end of day one, we spend about 10 or 15 minutes just going into doing a deep dive of how to actually do this on a day-to-day basis. That link to register is there as well. Tommy, I appreciate the conversation as always, man. We'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.